The limousine rolled slowly up the curved driveway of the Hargrave Pavilion, its black sheen catching slivers of the setting sun. Evening had spilled over the city like honey, warm and rich, touching the stonework of the grand event venue with a coppery glow. White-gloved valet attendants stood poised, expressionless, as luxury cars came and went in waves. Teslas, Bentleys, one orange McLaren that purred like a challenge. Guests stepped out in silk, tuxedos, and couture, their laughter soft, their egos louder. And yet, when the limo came to a halt, no one leaned forward. No heads turned. No anticipation built. Until the door opened, and she stepped out. She didn't move like the others, not rushed, not in search of approval. She stood still first, took in the building, took in the scent of expensive cologne, freshly waxed floors, and $1,000 champagne drifting out through the open doors. Her name was Nadia Atwood, not a celebrity in the sense of tabloid culture. She wasn't the kind to be recognized by face alone. But her name in certain rooms held weight, especially in circles where funding, innovation, and legacy collided. Inside the pavilion, the annual Hargrave Innovators Gala was already underway. The lobby was lit like a ballroom in Versailles. Gilded walls, pendant chandeliers, sculpted ceilings designed to remind people of power. A string quartet played softly behind a floral arch that cost more than some homes. Nadia's heels echoed down the hallway as she entered. She passed couples in designer labels, executives laughing too loudly, women casting glances that evaluated rather than admired. She walked past a group of men by the champagne bar. They turned, paused, then returned to their conversation. She wasn't accompanied. She didn't wear a designer name on her chest. Her makeup was neutral. Her hair was natural. She didn't look like the guest of honor. And so, they assumed she wasn't. Near the reception desk, a coordinator adjusted name cards. Her fingers froze when Nadia approached. She hesitated before asking for her name, as if the answer would need verification, or perhaps be denied. When Nadia gave it, the woman's lips parted, startled. But before a welcome could form, someone from the back tapped the woman's shoulder. A senior staffer in a headset, the kind that managed logistics for events with high-profile donors. His eyes swept across Nadia quickly, up, down, the kind of scan that wasn't looking for identity, but justification. She didn't flinch. She simply waited. A pause, then a nod. Her name was indeed on the list, not as a guest, not even as a keynote, but as the recipient of the Innovators Laureate, the highest honor awarded at the gala. And still, the man hesitated before leading her to the elevators. Because presence, for some people, never arrives without suspicion. While others entered without credentials, without questions, without the weight of proving themselves, Nadia was escorted like a possible trespasser. But she had expected this. She had lived this pattern before. It happened in boardrooms, in hotels, on flights, at universities where she was meant to be the speaker, but was asked to wait outside the door until the organizer arrived. It always started with doubt, and always ended with silence. Upstairs, the ballroom was twice the size of the lobby. Golden light reflecting off polished floors, tables arranged like chess pieces. Place cards glittered under crystal centerpieces. At the far end of the room, a stage had been erected, its backdrop emblazoned with the name of the event. Behind the curtain, a reserved area, her name on the door. But first she had to cross the room. And rooms like this weren't built for easy passage. She walked through the crowd. People turned to look, some with curiosity, some with confusion. One woman whispered something and laughed. A man near the appetizer station glanced at her shoes, then at her face, then back at his colleague. They weren't cruel, just used to reading the room a certain way. And she had rewritten the rules simply by being there. As she reached the far side, a middle-aged woman in a gold dress stepped in front of her path. Her eyes narrowed, her voice sharp, accusatory. She asked who Nadia was looking for. Said the staff entrance was through the back. The air thickened. People nearby went quiet. A man behind Nadia lowered his champagne glass slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't correct the woman. She simply opened her small clutch and handed over a single card, black, matte, engraved. The woman read the name. Read it again. Her mouth opened but nothing came out. Because the guest she had just dismissed was the only reason the gala had secured full funding that year. Because Nadia Atwood was not only the guest of honor, she was also the largest donor in the event's history. The one who had built her tech company from a single-page patent. The one who had just signed a multi-million-dollar pledge to fund STEM education for underrepresented girls. And the one who, tonight, would be awarded in front of them all, with cameras, lights, and a standing ovation from the very people who had doubted her existence 10 minutes earlier. But not yet. For now she stood silently, watching the woman with calm eyes, letting the moment settle. Because silence, once again, would say what words could not. Upstairs, the air shimmered with glass and status. The chandeliers, each one imported from Venice and cleaned weekly by specialists, bathed the room in a warm, golden haze. Waiters moved like dancers, synchronized in their black uniforms, balancing trays of amuse-bouches that floated from table to table like whispers. Conversations twisted in polite spirals, deals discussed in hushed voices, affiliations dropped like currency, compliments wrapped around calculations. Nadia was seated at table 1. It was positioned dead center in front of the stage, slightly elevated on a subtle platform that placed it just high enough to remind everyone where to look when the lights dimmed. Around her were board members, politicians, billionaires in glossy tuxedos, women in gemstone tones who wore their pedigree like perfume. The name card next to her bore the name of a man who hadn't yet arrived, Lawrence Kessler. A legend in the startup space. A funder of ideas, a breaker of companies, a gatekeeper in 1,000 untold ways. She had met him once, years ago, when her prototype had barely left her apartment. He had smiled thinly and said her design was too optimistic. Then he moved on. And yet now he was seated next to her. Funny how proximity changed once the world believed in you. A host walked past her chair and nodded curtly, still unfamiliar with her presence in this position. The pianist at the far end adjusted tempo. Somewhere near the open balcony, 2 executives stood pretending not to stare in her direction. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had only become quieter, more strategic. Earlier in the evening, after the brief confrontation in the ballroom, Nadia had been ushered to the green room behind the stage. Event coordinators apologized in hurried tones, offering water, asking if she needed a stylist touch-up. She had declined it all. She didn't need adjustment. She needed them to sit with their discomfort. She had learned long ago that discomfort was the beginning of change. And so she sat at the table now, poised, spine aligned with the back of the velvet chair, not speaking unless spoken to. She didn't need to perform. Her presence performed enough. A slideshow rotated slowly on the screens around the ballroom, showing past honorees. They were all predictable, older, white, male. A few women. Fewer faces like hers. Her photo was last in the sequence, but when it flashed, it changed the room. Not just because she was black. Not just because she was young. But because her story didn't originate in boardrooms or hedge funds. Her story began in libraries. In government housing. On scratched laptop screens. In nights when the only light came from ambition and the only applause came from her own persistence. She felt no need to shrink now. The event moved forward. Speeches began. Toasts were made. Forks clinked against plates. Someone on stage mispronounced the name of a Nigerian chemical engineer being awarded posthumously. No one corrected it. Nadia caught the error, wrote it down silently, and tucked the note into her clutch. Her attention never wavered. Because for her, presence was more than physical. It was political. It was historical. When the MC approached the podium to announce her award, the room dimmed slightly. A hush rolled through the tables. Screens lit up. Footage played, a montage of her company's beginnings. Laura's videos of her working from a single desk. A viral clip from 5 years ago of her giving a TED-style talk in a packed university hall. Headlines scrolled. IPO numbers floated upward. Partnerships, charities, scholarships. And then the final image. Her standing with a group of middle school girls holding a robotics kit, smiling as they built something none of them had ever been told they were allowed to imagine. The applause started soft. Then it grew. People stood. Even those who had doubted her moments earlier. But she didn't rush to the stage. She stood with control. She walked with intention. And when she reached the microphone, she paused. Looked out over the crowd. Found the faces that had looked through her. The mouths that had told her, stop pretending you belong. She said nothing for a moment. Long enough for the silence to settle again. Long enough for people to wonder what would follow. And then she spoke, calm, resonant, steady. Not with gratitude. With gravity. Because this wasn't a thank you speech. This was a reminder that some people walk into rooms not to be celebrated but to be seen. Not to pretend they belong, but to redefine what belonging looks like. The morning after the gala arrived slowly, filtered through sheer curtains in the presidential suite. The room was quiet, a rare kind of quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. Nadia stood barefoot near the floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee in hand, watching the skyline shift under the weight of a rising sun. The city moved below her like a living circuit board, taxis humming, lights blinking, people pouring into sidewalks like particles of purpose. Last night hadn't left her. Not in the way nights typically do. It had branded itself, not with glory but with gravity. The awards sat untouched on the low table by the bed, still encased in its box, still shining with names and symbols and prestige. But she hadn't picked it up yet. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. She had spent years preparing for that moment, not for the recognition, but for the inevitability of being told again that she didn't belong. Every speech she gave, every panel she sat on, every room she entered carried the same emotional tax. And the cost wasn't measured in nerves. It was measured in restraint. Because it was never about being ready. It was about staying composed. She sipped the coffee, eyes still on the skyline. Down below, someone was being turned away from a doorman's entrance. Another reminder that systems didn't sleep. They simply recharged. She had been invited to a private breakfast on the rooftop, informal gathering of honorees and major donors, the text had read. She didn't reply. Not yet. She wasn't sure if she would go. She knew what would wait for her there. Praise mixed with possession. Smiles wrapped in recalibration. The very people who overlooked her yesterday would now try to orbit her presence, as if adjacency could absolve erasure. Instead, she opened her laptop. Her inbox had exploded. Hundreds of messages. News outlets requesting interviews. Schools asking her to speak. Venture capitalists extending friendly introductions. A few critics, of course, online profiles accusing her of being an overhyped diversity hire or playing the race card to build sympathy. She ignored them. She'd learned long ago that criticism without proximity was just projection. Scrolling down, she paused at one email. Subject: You changed my daughter's life. It was from a mother in Detroit. A nurse who had seen the gala's live stream and recognized Nadia from a mentorship program 3 years earlier. Her daughter had been in the robotics class. The girl, once quiet and unsure, was now studying mechanical engineering. Full scholarship. And she had started a small tech club at her school. Nadia closed her laptop slowly. Not because the message overwhelmed her, but because it grounded her. Recognition was temporary. Impact wasn't. She showered, dressed simply, and tied her hair into a low knot. No makeup. No curated appearance. She wanted to walk through the day as herself, not as a version of herself that made other people comfortable. By the time she arrived on the rooftop, the breakfast had already begun. Crisp linens covered the tables. Waiters moved like shadows. Plates of fruit, scones, and artisan cheeses adorned each setting. Conversations flowed in bursts, clinks of silverware punctuating every exchange. The city lay sprawled below the glass balustrade, a silent witness. Heads turned as she approached. This time, no one questioned her presence. But she could still feel the discomfort, not hostile, not overt. Just unfamiliar. She had forced them to rethink their assumptions, and that sort of shift doesn't happen quietly. It causes ripples. It causes recalculations. She sat near the edge, facing the skyline. A few people came over, offering compliments, asking questions. She listened more than she spoke. She had no desire to explain herself again. Eventually, Kessler, the legendary investor from her table, approached. He greeted her differently now, with measured deference. They spoke briefly, though she could feel his unease. He asked about her company's next expansion. She answered plainly. When he tried to steer the conversation toward acquisition offers, she declined with a tone so final it required no repetition. He didn't linger. Later, one of the women who had stared at her the night before approached her table with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She complimented Nadia's speech, commented on how refreshing her presence was, and then, without pause, asked for a photo for the organization's social media. Nadia agreed, but only after asking what the caption would be. The woman stumbled. Nadia waited. Eventually, the woman mumbled something vague about inspiration. Nadia declined the photo. Not rudely, just honestly. She didn't exist to decorate their feeds. She existed to confront the filter itself. After breakfast, she left the venue alone. No entourage. No press trailing. She walked a few blocks to the park, bought a bottle of water from a street vendor, and sat beneath an elm tree with bark as scarred as her memory. She watched people. Young girls in uniforms rushing to school. A boy skating across cracked pavement with more grace than gravity. A woman arguing on the phone, face flushed with frustration. And she breathed. Fully. For the first time since the applause. Because applause, she had learned, wasn't air. It was noise. And impact was always quieter than that. She opened her phone and drafted a message to her team. Not about the award. About the mentorship budget. She wanted to double it. Add another city. Make room for more girls like the one from Detroit. Then she paused, looked up, and smiled, not for the crowd, not for the press, but for herself. Because this stillness, this choice, this life, this was the real stage. And on it she was no longer pretending to belong. She had built the floor it stood on. A week had passed, and the weight of the evening still echoed, not as applause, but as aftershock. Nadia had returned to her home office in Chicago, far from the gold-leafed chandeliers and murmured slights of Hargrave Pavilion. Her penthouse apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, the skyline crisp and glassy beyond it. Here, no one second-guessed her entrance. No one asked her to wait by the service door. The silence here was earned. Still, the outside world buzzed. Her company's name had surged in searches. New clients reached out. Venture capital firms that had once ghosted her resurfaced with carefully crafted emails and polished decks. Some praised her resilience. Others framed her as the next face of innovation. None of them knew her, really. They knew her moment. They wanted a piece of it. She moved through these days with calm calculation. Mornings were for internal meetings, product development, user metrics, funding allocation. She drilled into feedback, data dashboards, back-end performance. Her team was lean, sharp, and loyal. Most had followed her through years of underfunding, late nights, and rejected proposals. They didn't need to be told what the gala meant. They had lived its silent prequels. Afternoons were for public obligations, interviews, conferences, and digital panels. She chose them carefully. Not because she was afraid of overexposure, but because she knew attention came at the cost of dilution. Every time she was framed as a symbol, she lost a piece of narrative control. So she curated her appearances like she curated her product launches, with purpose. In the evenings, she returned to her solitude. Books open, notes spread, calendar reminders blinking. But beneath the stillness, something stirred, not doubt, not fatigue. A calling. Louder now than it had been before. Because something had shifted inside her. The gala hadn't just revealed how the world viewed her. It had revealed how much of herself she had trained to stay small in order to survive those rooms. And now that she had stood in the center of one, lit, applauded, and still doubted, she knew she couldn't keep playing small just to be let in. She began writing. Not for press. Not for her brand. For herself. She opened a private document titled The Blueprint. It wasn't a memoir. It wasn't even a book. It was a recalibration. A new framework for how she wanted to lead not just her company but the next generation of founders like her. Black, female, brilliant, and endlessly underestimated. She wrote about boardrooms that smiled but dismissed. She wrote about conference calls where her voice was mistaken for an assistant's. She wrote about mentors who told her to tone down the ambition if she wanted to be fundable. And then she wrote about nights spent rebuilding prototypes from scratch after investors ghosted her. She wrote about the girl in Detroit. The mother's email. The look in a little girl's eyes when someone that looked like her was finally at the front of the room. This wasn't bitterness. It was blueprint. Each paragraph was a cornerstone. Each sentence steel. Because if people were going to tell her she didn't belong, she would not only build a seat, she'd weld the table beneath it. Days turned into plans. Plans into frameworks. She called 2 of her advisors and outlined a new initiative. Not another scholarship program. Not another panel. Something deeper. An incubator. For girls like her. From neighborhoods like hers. With ideas bigger than the rooms they were allowed to enter. Not a marketing campaign. A machine. Built to find them, fund them, and fortify them before the world told them to shrink. She named it the Honor Project. A quiet response to the not-so-quiet humiliation she had endured at the gala. Because if the world was going to applaud her at the top, it had to reckon with the fact that it tried to bury her at the base. The launch was set for 6 months out. She didn't tell the press. She didn't leak the concept. She called her lawyer. Had the name trademarked. Hired a branding team made up of young black designers who had pitched to her just a year before and left empty-handed. She called them back now. Told them she had a job. Paid their rate without negotiating. And then she flew. First to Atlanta. then Oakland, then Newark. She visited schools, not to give speeches, to listen. She sat in classrooms, watched how confidence died in real time when teachers skipped over hands too often, listened to principals who stretched budgets thin just to buy working calculators, watched young girls walk past trophy cases filled with boys' jerseys and empty plaques where STEM should have been celebrated. She didn't bring press. She didn't film content. She just absorbed. And then she wrote more, mapped more. Every barrier they told her she had overcome she now saw as a mirror for the barriers still crushing those behind her. And it enraged her. But more than that, it focused her. Because legacy wasn't about the award on your desk. It was about what you built after the applause faded. And Nadia Atwood had no intention of fading. By the time summer folded into early autumn, the rooftop gardens of downtown Chicago grew heavy with wind and promise. The honor project, still unnamed in the public sphere, had taken shape behind closed doors, and Nadia had begun constructing not just a program, but an infrastructure. One that would not rely on gatekeepers. One that did not ask permission to exist. She rented a 6th-floor building in the South Loop. Not sleek, not flashy, a former industrial warehouse with steel beams and exposed brick. She didn't renovate the soul out of it. She made it a living space. Tables, computers, soldering stations, soft corners for notebooks and whiteboards. Every window opened wide. The ceilings, like her mission, remained high. The press finally caught on. Someone leaked a planning permit tied to her name. Tech blogs speculated. Forums debated. Some thought it was a new product lab. Others assumed she was launching a VC firm. Few guessed the truth: she was planting the roots of generational disruption. When asked for comment, she said only this: "We're not building the next big thing. We're building the next right thing." The launch event was invitation only. But the invitations didn't go to donors. They went to daughters. To the girls who had written her letters. To the ones whose mothers had DM'd her on Instagram. To the educators who had printed her photo and taped it to lab doors. On the day of the event, sunlight fractured through the windows like it had been waiting months just to attend. The girls arrived in waves, wide-eyed, nervous, dressed in Sunday best or school uniforms or whatever felt brave enough for a day like this. Their parents lingered nearby, unsure if they were allowed to feel proud yet. Inside, the space had been transformed into a walkable timeline. From chalk drawings of her first schematics to artifacts, the burnt-out laptop, the first 3D printed prototype, rejection letters she never deleted. Then, news clippings, screenshots, funding milestones. A mural of faces, not hers, but of every student whose name had appeared in her inbox since the gala. At the far end, a small stage waited. No podium, no hierarchy, just a place to stand and be heard. And when Nadia finally appeared, simple blouse, jeans, no jewelry save for the bracelet her mother had given her at graduation, she didn't stand on that stage. She stood next to it. Because this day, like this project, wasn't about her. She welcomed them, not with a speech, but with a question. What would you build if no one told you no? Silence, then a murmur, then a wave of stories, girls lining up to sketch their ideas. One by one. A mechanical arm for people with limited mobility. A portable greenhouse for food deserts. An app to report unsafe streets anonymously. They weren't just students. They were engineers. And she saw it in their eyes. No one questioned if they belonged. Because now they built the belonging. In the days that followed, funding offers poured in. Corporations reached out with performative enthusiasm. Politicians called. News stations offered exclusives. She declined most of them. Her staff expanded carefully, mostly young women who had once been told to lower their voices in STEM classrooms. The honor project had no commercials. Only outcomes. And still, the voices came. You're turning this into activism, not innovation. You'll alienate real investors. This isn't sustainable. She listened. She didn't flinch. She hired a former school principal from Baltimore to lead curriculum design. A robotics prodigy from Nigeria to build out hardware training. A data scientist from Detroit to monitor program impact. Her board? Mostly women. Majority black. And for those who kept asking why she built it in Chicago, she had one answer. Because I'm tired of hearing that brilliance has to move to be seen. As the months passed, the first cohort began launching prototypes. At a citywide youth tech conference, 6 of her girls swept the top categories. Judges were stunned. Investors tried to network. One man asked Nadia which school had trained them. She pointed at the girls. They trained themselves. We just stopped getting in the way. At night, back in her office, she looked out across the city lights. She thought about that gala, the woman who tried to redirect her, the faces that didn't expect her name to carry weight. She thought about how easy it would have been to vanish after the award. Ride the applause into branding deals. Start a podcast. Write a book. But that wasn't legacy. Legacy was labor. And she wasn't done working. She closed her laptop, walked through the dark halls of her center, heard laughter echo from the prototype room. She smiled, because belonging was never about walking into their rooms and waiting for validation. It was about building your own room and leaving the door open. The evening was quiet in the old train station, long ago retired and now reimagined as a public forum space. Its marble floors polished, skylights restored to full brilliance, the architecture a reminder that beauty could be resurrected from the forgotten. This was where the Honor Project held its first annual showcase. There was no red carpet, no media frenzy, only chairs, light, and the sound of futures arriving. It had been 1 year since that gala, the night Nadia had walked into a room that questioned her existence and walked out owning the narrative. Since then, the world had changed, not loudly, not entirely, but undeniably. Inside the showcase hall, the girls she once welcomed with tentative smiles now stood behind their inventions, leading demonstrations with firm voices and fluid precision. Their tables displayed robotics kits, AI-integrated learning tools, mobility aids, and clean energy solutions made from reclaimed materials. QR codes linked to working codebases. Data dashboards scrolled live metrics. Patent filings had already begun. Their names were printed boldly. No nicknames, no minimization, just identity, unapologetic. Parents watched from benches. Teachers cried. And at the center of it all, not on stage but among them, stood Nadia. Hands folded, listening, observing, refusing to let the spotlight collapse everything into a singular story. She had long learned that her job wasn't to be the hero. It was to make sure no one needed one. The mayor stopped by. So did the governor. They gave short, respectful remarks. But the loudest applause came not from their presence, but from a 12-year-old girl who unveiled a voice assist device that translated emotional intent for nonverbal students. She had built it after watching her cousin struggle in school. Now, she wanted to donate the first 200 to underserved districts. Nadia watched her from a distance, felt her throat catch, just briefly, not because she was proud, but because this was the revolution. Not televised, not sponsored, rooted. She didn't stay long at the event. She never did. When the last girl finished her presentation, when the lights dimmed and the vendors began to pack, she stepped into the back alley exit, into the real world. The night was cool. The hum of the city lingered like a lullaby. She walked alone to the train platform nearby, not out of nostalgia, but out of rhythm. Her life had always moved like this, stillness in motion. The next week brought another award. A global summit wanted to name her Woman of the Year. She declined, not because she was ungrateful, but because she knew the world didn't need another face on a magazine cover. It needed more rooms. She kept building. A second honor center opened in Atlanta, then one in Nairobi. Her emails now overflowed not with invitations, but with intentions, girls applying with sketches, videos, problem statements. One asked to redesign bus schedules for her neighborhood so girls wouldn't have to walk unsafe streets in the dark. Another pitched a menstrual hygiene tracking app for rural schools. Nadia read every single one. She answered the first 50 herself. She funded the top 10 without hesitation. By now, her board had begged her to expand globally. She refused. Not until she'd gone deep, not wide. She wasn't scaling. She was sewing. One morning, a young woman entered her office for an interview, a recent graduate from one of the first Honor Project cohorts. She had built a biosensing device and now wanted to help lead mentorship inside the Chicago hub. Nadia asked her why. The girl looked at her with steady eyes and replied, "Because someone stood in the fire so I could build the house." Nadia didn't respond. She stood, walked to the window, watched the city pulse with lives being rewritten. And in that moment, she knew. She hadn't just walked into a room where they said she didn't belong. She had burned that room into memory, and used its ashes to lay the foundation for thousands more. No more pretending, no more asking for seats. She had become the blueprint. And the girls who followed, they weren't asking either. They were building.